Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Women in Innovation Building Success Grant Writing webinar today. This is the 11th webinar in the Building Success series. Shortly, I'm going to hand over to Ian, who's going to take you through it. I'd just like to say hello and welcome to everybody online, including, I know that we're joined by quite a number of men online today. So just a few things before we begin. There will be a Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. The chat function won't be monitored at that time, so if there's any questions posted in the chat box, we will not be taking them from that, so please do put them in the Q&A function. The webinar will be recorded. It'll be circulated to everybody directly afterwards in an email, but it will also be on KTN's website. As you will all have noted, everybody is on mute. This is because there's quite a lot of people in attendance today, and obviously we want to make sure everybody can hear the webinar throughout. So I'm not going to say anything else, and I'm going to hand over to Ian, who will take us through the grant writing process. So over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Shiwan. Thank you, everybody out there. I hope that you're in good health and that your loved ones are too. So we're now going to go through the questions that are used to assess your grants from Innovate UK and hopefully give you some hints and some useful ideas on how you can improve your application. Briefly, before I start, I'm going to touch upon the support that's available to help you fill in your applications. You've got the Knowledge Transfer Network, who me and Shiwan work for. We can help you. You've got the European Enterprise Network, which is based regionally, and you've got the Catapult Network, which are national centres of excellence. We're all funded by Innovate UK. If you're engaging with one of us, the advice should be the same. So please don't feel that you necessarily have to engage with all three of us. If you're getting the support you need from one of us, be comfortable with that's the right support and plough forwards. This is an overview, a snapshot of the support that Innovate UK offers through its network. Across the top, we have the Innovation Loans and the Investment Accelerator. Innovation Loans are loans to support late-stage innovation that would not be eligible for grant funding. The key characteristics of this loan is that you can borrow from Innovate UK between £100,000 and £1 million. You have a 3-year project implementation phase, and that's where you draw down the money quarterly in advance, and you don't make any payments, but interest is accrued. You have a 2-year go-to-market phase, where you don't make any repayments, but interest is accrued. And then you've got 5 years at the end of those 5 years to repay the loan out of revenue on your innovation. The interest rate is surprisingly good value. And you can imagine at the current moment in time, I'm not able to give you a number because it is based relatively on the Bank of England rate, and that has recently changed. The Investment Accelerator is where a project comes in and you get a grant from Innovate UK and you get a match investment from a bunch of VCs that are working with Innovate UK on these technical challenge. The middle line, you've got 2 types of grants. You've got responsive grants, smart awards, open calls. They open normally every quarter, typically give out about £15 million, and anybody can apply for those applications. And then challenge-led, which is based on the industrial strategy, are periodic and focused upon different challenges, say cybersecurity or the built environment. A key thing to get across very early on is the application rate for the responsive call is order of magnitude 10 times more than the challenge-led. And this means if you take the horse metaphor in the middle, it's much harder to win a race when there's many more entrants. So if you can apply underneath a challenge-led, I would urge you to do that because the cohort is much smaller. We'll touch upon this later on. Knowledge transfer partnerships. This is where you Take a recent graduate from a university, embed them in your company for between half a year and 3 years, and you get half a day a week from the university where they've come from to transfer knowledge and skills into your organisation. Finally, at the bottom, we have different forms of procurement that help. So that's very helpful. SBRI, Small Business Research Initiative. And the usefulness of that is it's a procurement process, so it's not a grant, so it doesn't come underneath de minimis. And that's something else for you to look out for. The Catapult network, we touched upon it earlier on. This is scattered throughout the country. As you can see, we've got things like the medicines, the future cities, digital transport systems, satellite applications. And if your innovation overlaps with one of these catapults, I would work with them because they have unrivaled knowledge both of the market to build your innovation, but also the market to take your innovation to, and the whole process of building your innovation. European Enterprise Network, Innovate UK's local network. These people have an unrivaled understanding of the innovation in a particular geographic area. They also run the highly successful and very useful Innovate to Succeed programme. And they can connect you with other innovation partners, perhaps supply chain, perhaps your customers in 60 other countries. To give you a feel of how big the Enterprise Europe network is, there's more people in the EEN network than what there are in the Commonwealth. And so as a result, we all know what's likely to happen, is due to happen, is legally committed to happen at the end of this calendar year. So do not get distracted by the middle word in that name, because if there's 60 countries in the network, I'm sure they can find space for us in whatever relationship we have at the end of this year. And ourselves, the Knowledge Transfer Network. We're organised in comparison to EEN, we're organised by technical sector, and our specialism is cross-sectorial innovation. What happens if you get different sectors working together? And the main thing that we're trying to do is connect you with your customers, your suppliers, your investors, to take your innovation to market. And we're also responsible for delivering this Women Innovate programme on behalf of Innovate UK. Now, let's go to the reason why we're here today, is understanding how to make better grant applications. The first thing I want you to get across is your grant application is scored on 10 questions, 3 appendices of about no more than 400 words each. And just like the advice you got that when you was at school, you have to make sure you answer the questions asked and leave no questions unanswered. It's key that you do this, and you want to reuse the keywords that are in the questions to make it really easy. The person who will be assessing you, there'll be 5 people assessing you. The person who will be assessing you is likely to have been paid £150 to read your assessment. And some of them will be churning through their answers. You have to think how long somebody will work for £150. If you're struggling to think of a time span, think how much your high street car dealer will work for £150 on your car, and the typical answer is 1 to 2 hours. And so you have to think that some people will be spending 2 hours working on your assessment, trying to decide if you're worthy. On the open call, let me touch upon the way the scoring works. We have a lower threshold for quality, and that is 70%. If you score less than 70%, your application is not deemed good enough. Everybody above the 70%, then we go through another metrics to do a balanced portfolio. So it's not just starting from the best, we can take into other considerations. But normally speaking, in something like the open call, the people selected could easily be getting quality scores of 80 to 85%. So you've got to make sure that you get every mark you can. Project summary. Now, This is the first thing that gets read. And many people read the sentence, "We will not score this summary," and don't really see the point, and they tend to be a little bit, dare I say, slapdash in the way that they fill it out. This is actually really quite a useful box. What happens is this box gets distributed to the assessors, and the assessors have to decide if they're technically competent to judge your application. Subconsciously, they will be using this to figure out if yours is an application that can be easily installed to allow them to answer the questions and complete the task of them in a timely manner. And what happens is if you use complicated English or make the project sound hard work, you tend to get refused by your first line assessors. And then what happens is it might be your second or third choice, pick up your project. And so the people assessing you, there is a possibility, are less versed in the topic than you would have liked. I am going to stress, think about writing at the economist level. So it's 9-word, punchy, active sentences. And the other point I will make is the assessors will believe everything you write in your assessment, in your application, until such time as they believe you are no longer truthful, and then they will disbelieve you. So you don't need to constantly reinforce everything, but please make sure that you don't make any statements which are not believable. The public description is only published if you're successful. The text will not be assessed, but you do need to see this as a piece of marketing material. I have seen this section used by investors in pipeline scouting or in collaborators for corporate venturing to see who they should be working with. So think of the hidden usefulness of this question. Now, the gateway question, the first most important question that gets assessed. This is to check if you're in scope. You need to think like a human computer. If you get rejected here, no more work is done on your assessment and your application is not taken anywhere. So if the scope says you must be X, just copy and paste whatever it is and go, yes, comma, we are. And I have known people to have been disregarded on, say, a geographical scope because they referenced a facility that was in the right geography, but the people assessing it didn't know that that facility was in the right geography. Hence the need to just copy and paste. The first question, what is the unmet need? What is it that businesses need? What are you trying to fix? And you explain how you fix it, and then you show the wider context. And to help you, I would suggest you use the Horizons tool. So if I was answering this, my first pass would be, the main motivation for this project is, and the need, and how we're going to respond to it. Hang on, this is a slide I wanted. I would be saying something like, our main motivation for this project was seeing the amount of plastic film being left unrecycled. So we explored and we discovered that the unmet business need was, the technical challenge was the melting point, and throwing this all together, we could see a market opportunity. Now, this example is completely made up, but you can see how you have now made it very easy for the assessor to tick off that you're answering the question as it's required. You'll probably end up being over 400 words, and then you need to do a little bit more wordsmithing to pull it back, but at least you've got some words for every tick box to help. I'm only going to present this once. In the email deck, you'll see this for every question going through, but can you see we expect most people to be scoring 8 to 9. Look at the increase in depth required to get yourself into a 9 to 10 element. And if you're going to be hitting 85%, some of your questions should be scoring 9. That's the main thing I want you to take out of this one. Next up, what is the approach? How are you going to solve the challenge? Why is it better than the competitors? Tell me you've got freedom to operate by referencing things like pattern searches, and perhaps consider putting a picture in Appendix 2 that delivers it with a bit of high impact. When it comes to the team, question 3, please don't be modest. Let's hear some upbeat confidence. Tell me you're the best and show me that other people believe in that statement. Talk about your track record and how you're going to get those resources and how you're going to take the product to market. Now, Market awareness. This is where we want to see that you understand it. I would urge you to avoid bottom-down market surveys. That's where you say things like the global automotive market is worth X trillion dollars, and if we get 1% of it. The reason why I'd urge you to avoid that is because it doesn't really tell you how you slot into it. I would urge you to consider bottom-up, where you say things like, our innovation is for a fuel tank in the automotive sector. Last year, 38 million cars were manufactured and they each had a fuel tank and a 15% market share. Much easier for the assessors to understand what that means. And the key word I would look at is I want this to be sensible, argued numbers. I am very, very reluctant when I see people say, if we conservatively assume that we would only take 1%, because you're inadvertently telling me that 99% of the time you do not know which market you're addressing. I would much rather you sort of say, we are aiming for 15% of small family cars manufactured in Europe that are next year, because that tells me you know who your customer base is going to be and how you would market. What is the outcome and how do you get your product to market? How are you going to increase your productivity? And a great tool to use here is the value proposition for your customers. There are some really good tools that you can easily Google on the internet, like the 5-level value proposition, and use that as a means of building your answer and explain where you sit in the marketplace and where this project's going to take you. What are the wider impacts of the project? The softer stuff, you know, the economic, social, environmental. And try and convert them, even if it's just a guesstimate, that you can provide that reasoned, argued approach to make it give them a monetary value. Also think hard about the regional impacts, about how you grow your local economy. That's very valuable for us to know. Project management has to be appropriate for the size of project that you're applying for. If you was applying for a £2 million aerospace project, then I would expect to see words like Prince 2 and things like that. If you're applying for a £25,000 project and you tell me that you're hiring a Prince 2 qualified person to manage the project, I would argue that the project management is not appropriate. But a Gantt chart augmented with team calls to check that everybody is on track is probably a lot more appropriate. What are the risks? This is a classic Goldilocks question, isn't it? It has to be risky enough that needs public money, but safe enough that the public money won't be wasted. Again, Google can be very helpful here. Some people have kindly put on their risk questions on the internet, and you can see the feedback they've got and use that as an inspiration for your own. Talk about how you're going to mitigate those risks and how you're going to manage them as time goes on. As it says, it could be a classic graph questions with impact and likelihood and label the axes and show how it all does together. I personally find this a hard question to answer because you seem to oscillate between the ridiculous and the impossible at times if you're not careful. Who would have imagined 2 years ago filling in a risk assessment that included a global pandemic might mean we stay at home for 6 weeks? The added value, this is where you talk about how the government is making things happen, and without the government support, there will be some downside. Look at things like saying the evidence that this project brings will allow investors to come on board because they can see that we're an investable proposition and things like that. If you can get third-party statements to augment this, all the better. And finally, how do we make sure that this project is good value for money for the taxpayer? Subcontractors need to be justified, and you can't use them just because you think they're surprisingly cheap, which is why you wish to offshore it to low-cost countries. Because you need to think that at the end of the day that we're looking for wealth generation within the UK in return for us investing in UK companies. The small print, think human computers, think pedantic. There is a competition helpline. I would urge you to email rather than phone for the main reason that their answers are much more binding when you have an audit trail. They will invariably ask people like me the question and get my answer and give me 72 hours or 24 hours to respond. but at least then it's verifiable what you've asked them, and you can use that when you respond. Now let's talk about the feedback. You'll get 5 assessors normally. They will, we will do a sanity check to make sure none of the assessors are outliers. If need be, we will get further assessors in to check. But what you tend to see is 1 person would really love it, 3 people are going to be in the main cohort, and 1 person is going to be negative or be much lower than the others. A large reason why people see this spread, I would argue, is because the language isn't as polished as it needs to be. And perhaps the person who's scoring low is just flicking through a lot quicker than the others and not picking out the key points that you've made. Simplify your language and draw it out, like I said at the beginning, so they can see where it's coming from. That would really help. These are the top tips. I think a big one for me that I would pull out of this is save somebody connected with the project who hasn't read any of the grant application for the final read through, so that they can ask the questions around clarity and say this point doesn't quite make sense. Because when you've worked on something and it's the 4th or 5th time that you've read the application form, you become a little bit word blind. And so having somebody there who's reading it fresh is very invaluable. I would also draw out, don't leave it too late to submit questions. Because if you're going to ask people like the Catapult, EEN or the KTN to do grant reviews, you need to give us time. And also, the grants have to be in at noon according to the computer sitting in Swindon. If you are 1 second late, you are rejected. So I would urge you to tell yourself the deadline for you is either 11 o'clock on the day, not noon, or ideally the day before, because the traffic has a massive spike when it comes to the deadline on the actual day. And if you can't submit because of IT issues, that's kind of your problem. So I always say earlier, noon the day before, the computer will be quiet. If there's any issues, you can still get people on the phone and see what's going on. Now, undertaking in difficulties. This is a rule that has recently been enforced, though I have not received any guidance if it will be enforced during COVID-19 times. Quite simply, if your company is less than 3 years old, you don't need to worry about it because you are still officially deemed to be a startup. Let's not have a big debate over what startup means. For the purpose of this rule, if you're less than 3 years old, you're a startup, rule doesn't apply. If you're more than 3 years old, and your losses are more than 50% of your subscribed shares, you are ineligible for any government support. This includes EIS, SEIS, innovation loans, grants, support from the Catapults, EEN, KTN, if significant, on a one-to-one basis. This happens more often than you imagine. How many startup founders have a director's loan with unpaid expenses and a company capitalisation of maybe 100 or 1,000 pounds? It is surprisingly easy to stumble into this. If you're in this situation, you can take professional advice and they can tell you what to do with those losses to recapitalise them if appropriate. And you are able to submit an updated cap table and profit and loss to show us that you are no longer an undertaking in difficulty. Now, one grant I want to bring you attention to, if you photograph the QR code, it will take you straight to the web page if you want to. That there is a competition that's closing on the 17th of April, magic time, noon, and it's all about responses to COVID. Some clear things we want to bring out on this is you've got to be able to deliver your project, or start your project, sorry, June 2020. And there will be no delays. It's got to be relevant to COVID-19. However, it can't be stuff that's already supported by government interventions, for example, ventilators. And the other biggie is it's 100% of your project costs. There is no need for a match, and the project, unusual for Innovate UK grants, isn't paid in advance. It will count towards your de minimis because it's a grant, not an SBRI call. Shiwan, this is your slide.
Yes, so as many of you'll have heard, the Women in Innovation Round 3 competition is opening soon. It opens in summer 2020. Up until about the week before it opens, there will be no scope or eligibility criteria available to view. We are just making people aware of it at the moment. There will be 10 awards of £50,000 and a bespoke package of mentoring, coaching and business support. We are looking for people with potential to become leaders in business innovation. And really the aim is to find women with exciting, innovative ideas, but also ambitious plans that will inspire others. You need to be a female founder, co-founder, or a senior decision maker in your business. And the company does need to be operating for at least a year. You'll know more about what is exactly in the scope and eligibility criteria when it is publicised, but I want you to make sure that you do realise that this is more than just the funding. So you will receive the funding, but all participants of the Women in Innovation funding are expected to take part and actively allow us to be able to help you to develop your business quickly. So therefore, if there is questions on the application form around what support would you like, please carefully consider these and write them down, because that will form some of the basis of your initial support package that you receive. So as I say, more details will be released in summer 2020.
Thank you. We have the Knowledge Transfer Network has a good application guide handbook that covers off a lot of what we've been talking. You can either visit the URL or scan the QR code to take you there. I believe we will be emailing out the slide deck to people who are on the call today as well, but you'll see a bit more detail in the good application guide. I'm hoping you've scanned that QR code by now. We touched upon the family earlier on and why you should reach out and get some support. If you want to get a photograph of the email address for the customer support service at Innovate UK, it's there, and there's their phone number. You can, of course, Google that information quite easily or find it on the Innovate UK website. KTN has a whole bunch of newsletters which will tell you about all sorts of opportunities by sector and technology, including funding and trade shows and events and trade missions and all those sort of good things. So I would encourage you to come to our website and register. And finally, I want to say thank you for listening to me today. I hope you found it useful. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn by taking a picture of the QR code so that you can reach out to me if you need to.
So we'll be going to Q&A now. So I've got a few questions for you, Ian. How would you go about partnering with a Catapult?
Oh, they're very nice, friendly people. Go to the website, there'll be contact information, including telephone and email, and just be as simplistic as ringing/emailing, saying, hi, we're like this is what we're looking for, would love to discuss. Another approach, which actually, no, sorry, I was going to say another approach is go to events, but that really is going to be quite difficult at the moment. In a few months' time, when life has returned to normal, they hold a load of events like we do. They often have drop-in clinics, which might have been moved online. So go and use that to engage with them as well.
Okay, so regarding the de minimis, does R&D tax credits prevent our company submitting a project for a grant if it exceeds €2,000 over 3 years?
If you have breached the de minimis support, yes, you won't be able to draw down your grant. Related, don't forget, it's not the question you've asked, but it is connected. If you get a grant, you can still apply for large company R&D tax credits on the work that you're doing on the grant. Quite a few companies forget that. You can't apply for small company R&D tax credits, but you can still get large company R&D tax credits. But de minimis still applies on grants.
Okay, I've got a comment that said, my application in the last mark round got 85%, but I knew a contact that scored 81% who received the funding. How do companies get picked? And are there any industries that the smart grant judges prefer?
So I think there's two elements to that. We are driven by our industrial strategy, which is published for the different sectors, and you can easily download that and see the roadmaps and see what we're looking for. And we do use a portfolio approach to balance the risks that we're taking. So passing the minimum quality is just one thing, and we definitely, as I said earlier on, don't go from best downwards. We look across the portfolio and fill the gaps that we've got.
I have noticed that the scope is now scored. How does this affect further evaluation, if at all?
I honestly don't know.
I would just chip in with this. If it doesn't fit the scope, you're unlikely to actually receive the funding for it. So do make sure that you try and meet the scope.
Well, it's more brutal than that, Shuan. If you don't fit the scope, the rest of your application is not scored. You'll get no feedback. I don't know. I didn't know that the scope was also added to the scores. That's news to me, which is why I'd have to go and check.
So, are we adversely impacted by including international collaborators as part of our team?
No, as long as it is sensible and correct for them to be part of it. I mean, it's not good when you see people who say things like, we've offshored our computer programming to a low-cost nation. That isn't building up the UK base. Just
to clarify on Ian's answer, remember this is UK grant funding. So where possible, they do encourage you to use as many UK companies as you can. So they will be asking for some justifications if you are shipping it internationally. It won't necessarily adversely impact your score, but it would just need justification.
Yeah.
So in terms of scope, are projects that include implementation in markets outside the UK marked down on scope?
No, if I understand the question correctly, if you're saying, is selling overseas a good idea? Selling overseas is a fantastic idea because it's good for our trade balance. What we don't want to be doing is investing in projects that are developed overseas and sell overseas, because that doesn't bring a return to the UK economy. But selling overseas with UK technology is fantastic.
Can you use UK subcontractors rather than payroll?
Subcontractors can only be used with full justification. The reason being, ignoring the grant that's at 100%. Normally, in a normal grant, you might be getting 1/3, say, or 2/3 money from the government, but subcontracting is, the subcontractor is paid at 100%. And so many project partners like to come in as subcontractors because they get 100% of the project funds. We don't view them in a, they're not as good a collaborator as somebody who has a bit of skin in the game, which is why we have to ask for subcontractors to be justified. But if you was to say be using a specialist skill or service just once for part of this project and not as ongoing delivery of the project output, then subcontracting would make sense. An example of this might be, say, CE testing. If you was to say we're subcontracting our CE testing to a specialist, that makes sense because you won't need to retest the CE after you've gone to market necessarily.
And can an academic be the lead?
Normally, no, but they would be going through their academic funding stream, won't they? The academics have a whole host of funding coming out of the rest of the UKRI family.
If a stated team member must be replaced for the project completion, is this an issue?
You would speak, so this is after you've got your grant, you would be speaking to your monitoring officer and explaining what's happened. People change jobs, people die, it's part of life. What's not so good is if you use one person who stays in the company and then you substitute them with a person not of the same skill set or quality, that's more of an issue.
Is KTN assessment independent of Innovate UK applications?
Yes. That's what I was saying, brutal, simple answer. Yes.
So regarding contractors, do we need to identify who they are before the application?
Yes, because you then need to justify them and explain that you're getting good value for money.
There's a question here which I'm going to take, Ian. So it was, will there be a men in innovation equivalent? No, there will not. The reason behind this is in 2016, Innovate UK did quite a lot of research into the application processes and found that only 1 in 7 applicants that were successful were from females. This has increased significantly, but it is still not equal. So actually the majority of application funding still does go to male-led companies. That's why this program is in operation. Let me see. Can you hold more than 1 grant from Innovate UK at one time?
Yes, but you can't apply more than once. You can't get more than 1 win in the same call. So if you was to say have an aerospace grant and then 3 months later you can get a smart award, and then 6 months after that you might go for an investment accelerator, that's okay. But you can't bombard the smart call or the aerospace call with 38 applications.
I'm just going to add on to that as well, Ian. So you get 2 submissions for each project, but for each project you cannot be funded more than once. So if your project idea is, I don't know, to install AI in all NHS hospitals to enable data capture for diabetes patients, then you cannot have that funded through one award and another award. So is it okay to introduce ourselves on the chat window to promote networking? Yes, please do so. Can academics and non-academics in universities apply for the Women in Innovation scheme? It is just for businesses, and the reason behind that is to encourage more female-led businesses to become innovative and role models. So unfortunately not, unless you are
but hang on, so if they, I'm going to put you on the spot, Siobhan. So if they went to the tech transfer company, tech transfer organisation, created a new startup / spin out and had a female-led leader of that, perhaps a female PhD graduate, that would be in scope, I ask.
I believe so. We have had spin-out companies that have received Women in Innovation funding before. They were all spun out in advance of a year, which I do have to say is one of the
1 year. They have to have spun out already, haven't they? Because you need that in your trading history.
Yes. So regarding the COVID-19 grant, how detailed are the responses to the questions expected to be? Because there is a 400-word limit and no appendices.
So I don't know if they mean, can they get away with 40 words, or what do they do if they want to write 500 and they want to put 100 in the appendix? So the answer should be towards 400. If you're significantly below 400, you're probably very light on detail. If you were going to write more than 400 and dump it in the appendices, you're all in the same boat, and you just need to be a bit harsher on your editing and just take slim hope that everybody else is in the same situation.
Okay, so I've got one again about the Women in Innovation one that I will pick up. So do we know approximately when the Women in Innovation call will close? It will usually open for at least a month. So anybody that's subscribed to the Women in Innovation newsletter, they will get an automatic email when the competition is live on the website, and including open dates and close dates on there. So do keep an eye on that, or sign up for the newsletter if you want to be automatically notified. Is there a cutoff pass mark for successful applications? If you are 1 point off, is resubmission with additional information likely to succeed, or will the pass mark change?
Well, we talked about the portfolio effect earlier on. So if you're one mark off, there's two elements to this, isn't there? The first element is if you're one mark off, you're not one mark off necessarily is, would you have fitted the portfolio anyway? And you should be going in significantly above the bottom quality threshold. And resubmissions would have to be for a new call. So are they going to do another COVID-19 call? I've absolutely no idea. But you could perhaps submit the idea in the smart call, say, if that was opened underneath that access route.
Can we apply when we are at inception stage, i.e. no tech prototype created? I think that really does depend on the call that you're applying for. If it's
and on the COVID-19 one, the requirement is that you have a material effect within a certain time span. And so you would need to make a compelling justification that you can go from, say, paper idea or bench prototype to a significant impact within the timeframes requested.
What is the most common source of match funding?
Retained profit, investment, and shareholders and founders' own funds, which is arguably another form of investment, isn't it?
Okay. Is this UK Smart Grants being delayed until the 27th of May? So I'm going to pick up that there is a delay on some of the Innovate UK competitions in light of the COVID-19 situation. So any ones that haven't already opened, quite a lot of them have been delayed by a month at opening. Any ones that are already opened, they have extended some of the close dates. So I would just double check on the IFS service, which is Innovate UK's website, and you will see the updated open and close dates. So what resources or help can I use to find partners for a project idea?
As we said earlier on, you've got the Knowledge Transfer Network, the European Enterprise Network and the Catapults. Reach out to them and ask for them for ideas and connections. And obviously your own personal business networking, which includes the use of things like LinkedIn to find companies to build the complete solution.
Okay. So there's one that says, I can't see anything to do with femtech. Does this mean anything to do with women's health is not preferred? There is a number of health competitions and Women in Innovation is open, as is smart grants to any kinds of technology areas. With regards to certain competitions, they are looking for certain types of innovation. That might be the case if you're talking about the specific COVID-19 call, that femtech would not be included in that scope, but there is scope for femtech in different competitions. In terms of ideas being sufficiently risky for COVID funding, are training services considered, or are you focusing mainly on physical products?
I think you would have to ask, it's making that compelling story that you're going to make a material step change in the environment that we find ourselves when the application goes in. So I'm not saying it's out of scope, but you can see the questions that are going to turn up.
So someone said that they don't really understand de minimis that well and would like to understand it better. They've received 2 Innovate UK grants in 2018, both around 300,000. Does that make them ineligible based on de minimis rules?
So there's going to be an awful cop-out that says, I'm not allowed to offer advice and you need to go to a suitable qualified person. It's a pity you can't see my face because my eyebrow is raised.
Okay, so I've got actually a comment more than a question. So we have an assessor on the webinar with us today, and they have clarified that the scope question is not scored. It is a yes or no response. So obviously, if it is a no and you are out of scope, you are ineligible then for that funding.
Thank you.
So for the current CV19 call closing on the 17th of April, with an application in process, can we send to you for review or feedback before it is submitted?
I think you have to ask, because we need to be comfortable that we've got the time to offer feedback and for you to engage with that feedback. It's really very disappointing when people reach out to you 48 hours before a deadline saying, can you read my grant application? Because you think, how am I going to find time myself to read it? And B, how are we going to have a sensible dialogue after I've read it to see if you need to change anything? So as long as you can, you know, explain that, do reach out.
So is the funding only valid for the applicant, or is it transferable to another person who is part of the company? This, to me, would make more sense in terms of the Women in Innovation programme, and it is therefore only eligible for the applicant. We are actually funding specific applicants for a project, but it is the applicant that receives the funding. Is there a percentage limit on overall grant for industrial partners? E.g., a company lead has an industrial partner that has 60% of a grant.
Specifics like that I would like to discuss on a case-by-case basis, because it's easy to miss a nuance, like how large is the company, how long have they been trading, and details like that, and offer advice that could be misconstrued by others.
So one person's asked, one section is regarding the team. As a very early stage startup, if you're a solo founder without a team, can you use the funding to hire, and will that affect scoring?
So I think that the better answer is, even if you're a solo founder, you can talk about your mentors, your non-exec directors, and express how you've got a team. You can then explain how you're going to fix those gaps. And I think it's completely acceptable to say you have the person identified. It depends on the size of the project. If you're getting a 50,000 COVID-19 response, I would struggle to see how you're recruiting a team per se in the time spans available, as well as the amount of money that you're asking for.
If my company was incorporated 5 years ago, but did not start any trading until 3 years ago, is it still a startup?
From memory, and this is where it gets really dangerous, I think it is the company foundation date, not the active trading date.
How do we request a KTN partner?
You speak to the knowledge transfer network, and we have an inquiries line, and that will get directed to the relevant knowledge transfer manager depending on which sector you come from, and have a conversation with them and see if they know anybody that they can connect you with. But I would urge you to find your own partners using, you know, the networking tools that exist. Like I said earlier on, LinkedIn in the current timeframes would be invaluable.
Should we include COVID-19 prolongment as one of the risks?
I think it's, yeah, to me, it seems quite relevant at the current moment in time.
Let me just see. Is it okay to have open roles in the application, i.e. research assistant to be hired?
I think that's acceptable. You know, if that's the way it is, I think it's, you know, it's, as like always, it's tell the story as well as you can with the information and resources you have to hand, and explaining how those resources will be filled is part of it. I would also urge you to consider a knowledge transfer partnership if you're thinking that you might want research assistants to help with industrial projects. They're a good tool to look out for, very well funded, permanently open.
If we are applying for the COVID-19 call as a subcontractor to a different lead application, can we still apply as a lead application for our own project at Smart Grants?
Yes, two different calls. They're two different applications. I would urge you to make them different as much as possible. One, for example, the subcontractor might be to a specific key market, whereas the one for the Smart Grant might be a baseline technology, platform technology, do things like that so they become different projects.
Right, we are starting to run out of time, so I'm going to start wrapping up. I'm going to do about another 5-6 questions, try and get through as many as we possibly can. I'm going to take the next question, if you don't mind, Ian. So, is there anything we can do right now to prepare for women in innovation? Yes, there is. Attend our webinars, and they should give you an idea, help you out. There are some webinars that we've already held. So we've held 10 previous ones. This is our 11th one. There's webinars such as value proposition, which actually might help you to articulate your answers correctly when it comes to performing your application process at a later stage. Make sure you read the scope, and I would also ask you to look into the program in more details. So there is on our webpage, on KTN's program page for Women in Innovation, a lot of details about the program. You'll be able to read stories from different founders that have been our award holders and really get to hear about their experiences to get the most of the program if you do get awarded funding, and also some advice if you don't get awarded funding. So if I want to apply for a grant, how much of the business idea has to be developed?
I don't understand the question. So let me try and understand the question. So if you, oh, I mean, I think the way I would express that at the risk of misunderstanding the question is, we want to see a sensible, compelling story for the journey. So if you were going from idea to bench prototype to pre-production, pre-production to market, you can see how they're different grant applications using the different tools that we have. I don't expect you to go from idea to market in one grant application necessarily. In some sectors, that's easier than others. So if it was a digital sector where it's much easier to deploy, you're more likely to make more of the journey than, say, if you were doing automotive vehicles where the projects are much bigger, or biotech where the projects are much bigger and the trials and everything are much more riskier.
Could you say any more about the balance the project needs to appear risky enough to get the funding, but not too risky to be unfundable?
Unfortunately not, because it really depends on the sector and the state of the project. I know that's not the answer you were hoping for. I will refresh your memory that Google, you can find out other people's applicants and the feedback they've got. And that's a really good way of trying to see how other people have been perceived.
Okay. Am I correct in understanding that there is an opportunity to edit your application after initial feedback?
So there's two answers. If you was to ask somebody like EEN, KTN or the Catapults to offer feedback, then yes, because that's pre-submission. And if you was to do that route, I would be urging you normally, I mean, I know the COVID-19 grants on a short notice, right? Let's just park that for one side. Normally, I'd be saying, when you're first thinking about it, maybe 4 weeks ahead of the deadline, you would reach out to those organizations and give people 2 weeks notice that you're coming in, and then we can block out the time. Then you'll give us your draft application and give us, say, a week for us to do our feedback, and we'd want to get it returned to you a week before the deadline so you can incorporate it and have a conversation with us. If you've submitted a grant application and it has been assessed, then you cannot resubmit as part of that call. You would take on the feedback and resubmit it as another application in another call.
Will there be a smart round after May?
The honest answer is, I don't know. I can tell you what's happened in the past, and I can draw a curve for you based on the past data points on that curve. But I'm not the person who's able to give a commitment that will tell you that that curve is an accurate prediction of the future, because I just don't have that knowledge to hand. And that was before the COVID-19 outbreak. You can imagine that the government response in the future is quite likely going to be significantly different than the response in the past. And I would expect it to be a more, well, if we used to have a conversation 3-6 months ago about government paying 80% of people's salary, it would have been impossible to imagine. So I think that gives you an indicator of where the curve might be going in the future.
So somebody has asked, can there be a webinar on the business-led innovation for COVID-19? There has already been one done. It is recorded and available to view. You should be able to view it through Innovate UK's website. If you have problem finding it, we'll also include it in the email link that we send round for this recording. How does the undertaking in difficulty definition work with bootstrapped self-funded companies?
The same for everybody else. If you're less than 3 years old, it doesn't apply. If you're more than 3 years old, it's accumulated losses relative to your shareholder capital. It is a rule which has caught out many companies in the last few years, and I have every empathy for bootstrapped companies who probably not taken a salary, not been paying expenses, probably got 100 or £1,000 worth of shared capital issued. You're quite likely going to be tripping up over it. Get some good professional advice, and there are things you can do to make yourself pass the rule quite often. And don't forget to resubmit the paperwork to show that you're no, because we would just use Company House for the last set of accounts. So you can, if you know that Company's House has you as an undertaking in distress UID, just mention it in other information and put in the appendix the revised documentation to show that you're in scope again.
Okay, I'm just trying to see if there's one. Okay, women in innovation funding. If we are an SME company where the wife is owner of 50% share of the company, can she apply for the women in innovation funding? Yes, she is a co-owner or co-founder, so therefore she is eligible to apply as long as she's been trading for over a year. I think we've already answered quite a few of these. I'm just going to see if there's one quick one that we can do right before we close the webinar out. Is there funding available for initial market research to validate an idea before applying for funding?
I believe you can do that through, yes, I believe you can do that through Smart Award, for example. And I would encourage you to do market research before taking your project forward, because we want to see projects that are driven by the needs of the users and customers.
Okay, and I've just got one more that's relevant for people to know. So about getting feedback on applications before they're submitted. Is the Catapult feedback free of charge?
That depends on the catapulting question, and so I'm not able to answer, unfortunately.
I would urge you to ask them. Just make it clear in your ask if it is free of charge or not. If they are charging, there is other routes, as Ian said earlier, that you can go down. So you can contact KTN or EEN, who provide feedback free of charge. And I would just look at them options in that instance. But please do remember what Ian said about giving us enough notice to be able to look at the applications. So we've come to the end of the webinar today. I'm sorry that we didn't answer all of your questions. We've had over 105 questions that were submitted. If there is anything else that you would like to know, there is, as I said, the COVID-19's webinar available, which will circulate afterwards. Anything about scope and eligibility for the Women in Innovation call, please get in touch with me after they've been released, because before that, I'm afraid I can't comment on them, and neither can Innovate UK. But after that, we will be able to help you with them. There's the support email from Innovate UK that you can get in touch with for any very specific questions, or you can ask a representative at KTN, EEN, or maybe one of the Catapults may be able to help you as well for answering anything else. Ian, can I just ask you to flick onto the next slide?
Of course.
Thank you. So for the Women in Innovation programme, as I said, if you're not already part of our newsletter, you will receive automatic notifications when the Women in Innovation competition goes live, and any of our other events that we're holding, includes in our webinars. We've got one webinar that isn't scheduled, well, it is scheduled just yet, but the tickets aren't on sale, aren't able to register for it just yet, but will probably be by the time we circulate the emails out, and that is on the 22nd of April. That is discussing leadership. If you want to join our online community, the web address is written for you there, and so is my email address. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you'll join one of our future webinars. Thank you.
And thank you from me as well.